will try to convince you that it might be a good idea to develop painkillers for software animals. And that's, of course, why you're going to think me a mad scientist. The real reason is this. Every year, about 4.1 million lab animals are used in the UK every year. A lot of people think this is too much. Indeed, a lot of researchers think it's too much because they also care about the animals. It's not that fun to actually use animals for various things, even though, of course, we use even more animals for food. But it's still something most researchers would like to reduce. Also, there's an economic thing. Mice are expensive. I know that because I get spam mail about buying genetically modified mice, which is wonderful evidence that we're actually living in the future. So what could we do to reduce the number of lab animals we're using? Well, we can, of course, refine our procedures, do them more carefully, figure out if we can answer many more questions with every experiment. But we can, of course, also try to use virtual things. We can actually make simulations. And this is where my background as a computational neuroscientist shows up. So the idea is to work just like we do in physics and astronomy and a lot of other disciplines. You take a system you want to understand, you build a mathematical model, you run this in a computer, you look at the results, and hopefully you learn something about the system. Maybe you learn that your model is wrong. That typically happens all the time, actually. Sometimes you get a prediction, and then you can go over to the lab and check it. And sometimes, of course, you get interesting behaviors in the model that suggest entirely new avenues of research. And we're developing better and better models, and hopefully we can replace a lot of lab animals this way. Now, mathematical modeling of biology, and especially the nervous system, has a long history. So back in 1952, Hodgkin and Huxley published a really classic paper. They had a diagram, the one up in the upper left corner. So this is an action potential running along the axon of a giant squid. It's a simple nerve impulse, and they describe the theory of how nerve impulses work. That diagram is the result of a mathematical calculation they did, their model of what was going on. It took them 6 weeks, using a hand-cranked calculator. Below that black and white picture, there's a colorful picture with some kind of hexagons. And that's a modern supercomputing simulation of a part of a cerebral cortex, containing tens or hundreds of millions of nerve cells, rendered in exquisite detail, a lot of biochemistry and electricity being calculated. It just runs 1,000 times slower than real time, which is pretty decent. In the upper middle, we have a beautiful ink drawing by Raymond Uehiro, who was working in the traditional manner. Take a piece of tissue, put it in a microscope, watch it, draw it. Below, we have a result from the Smith lab at Stanford, where you take a piece of tissue and you slice it up, you stain it using various antibodies, you image that, you remove those antibodies, add new antibodies to see other chemicals, you remove them, repeat this process, and finally you scan this with an electron microscope. The result? A three-dimensional map of a small piece of tissue where you can see exactly where the molecules that indicate that this is a nerve cell, that's a synaptic connection, that's a bit of Alzheimer plaque that you should get rid of. But you can put them together and get a wonderful, vivid three-dimensional map. And of course, our computers are getting much more powerful too, from the hand-cranked calculators to awesome supercomputers. So where is this leading? Well, it suggests that we're going to get bigger and bigger, better and better simulation. We're going to be better at taking real biological systems and scanning them in various ways and turning them into software. And where is that going to end? Well, I believe that eventually we're going to end up with emulations, literally one-to-one simulations of entire brains. At first, of course, we're going to be very crude approximations. But gradually, we're going to move from a simulation, where something just looks like the original, to an emulation, where something actually behaves internally just like the original. Here is an example from the computer world. To the left is the ZX81 computer. Anybody around here who had one? Yes. Yes, it was a wonderful computer. 1 kilobyte of memory, 44 times 60 points resolution. You connected it to your television set. And most of us who loved it can't use it today, mostly because television sets don't have the right connectors anymore. But we can run the software to the right. which actually does exactly the same job. When I press a key on the real computer and when I press a key on the virtual computer, the same computations happen. Every operation of a microprocessor, what's fetched into memory, is repeated in an emulation. I'm talking that we might be ending up with something like that for entire brains. This could be an entire talk, of course, about, is this actually possible? Are the crazy people actually trying to do it? The answer is, of course, yes. Some of them are my friends, are working on scanning nematode worms or fruit flies. And there is interesting questions about the philosophical fundamentals, whether this actually could work, and could this actually produce something human-like or even animal-like? But I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to keep to the ethics. As I said, I'm in the philosophy department now. If we were to have brain emulations, would that solve the problem with having lab animals? Well, first of all, we need an awful lot of lab animals to actually develop those brain emulations. But once you have them, we might have a standard lab rat and use that for all our experiments forever. No real fuzzy warm lab rat would ever need to be sacrificed for that. Scientists would say, wait a minute, this is a low-level simulation. It might not actually contain the relevant information. Maybe it's wrong, and how can we tell without comparing to real animals? And I think these two are very good problems. But I think the third one is really the fun one. How much should we care about the virtual mice? So when we think about why we care about animals, there are various philosophical theories about it. The classical oldest ones say that actually animals don't matter morally. However, as Immanuel Kant would say, if you see somebody kicking a dog, he's a cruel person. That cruel intention is bad. The fact that the dog is yelping, that doesn't matter very much, but the intention, that was immoral, you shouldn't do that. Other theories say, actually what matters is not anything intrinsic in an animal, or a human for that matter, but the relationships going on between our organisms. But most of us would say, actually, the internals up here probably do matter somewhat. Many theories say that actually animals have lives too. They are living a life, they have little life projects, very simple ones, of course, in the case of mice and insects, but they still have kind of preferences. They try to avoid pain, they try to mate, they try to do various things, and we might actually not have a right to interfere too much with it. Some people would argue that human rights actually go ahead of animal rights, but you might still acknowledge that we should care a bit about the animals. And finally, there are theories saying that actually suffering is suffering. As Jeremy Bentham very famously said, it matters not if they can think, but whether they can suffer. So if I pinch the tail of a mouse, it feels pain. If somebody pinched my tail, I seem to have mislaid it, but if I had a tail, I might actually be experiencing exactly the same form of pain. So if pain is something bad, and it's wrong to inflict pain on others, maybe one shouldn't inflict it on animals. Okay, what does this lead to software? Can we make software that suffers? So these pictures show educational software, one to study the psychology of operant conditioning and one for a virtual rat dissection. And I think this is just images. There is nobody at home. Essentially, it's pictures that elicit a certain response, maybe a bit of a yuck reaction to the right one, but it's really a picture of a picture. However, you can make a more complicated simulation. Some of you might have been playing around with Tamagotchis, these little virtual pets that you need to feed and care for, otherwise they become very unhappy. Of course, most of us are aware on some level that we're not actually unhappy. The state diagram on the right here shows a kind of transitions between different states. So when there is too little interaction, move to the unhappy state, which means you play a sad little song and show a sad face. But that's just the same thing as the happy state, where you play a cheerful song and show a cheerful face. To the computer, there is no difference. It doesn't seem to be anything at home here. I think most of us would say it doesn't matter if you maltreat your Tamagotchi, except that Immanuel Kant would still say that the man who maltreats his Tamagotchi is a cruel man. But as we move to more advanced simulations, things get iffier. Rodney Cotterill was interested in the question of what consciousness was and developed a fairly elaborate simulation of a little baby. And this has a quite elaborate model of a body, including the amount of nutrients it has and how full the nappy is. It has a brain that is mapped actually based on ideas of how the real brain works. It needs to get food. If a nutrient level gets too low, it dies. And it can do things like flailing around its arms and scream, very much like a real baby. And then the user can change nappies and give it milk. And the idea was to demonstrate that this could learn how to get food and get clean nappies. Now, is this conscious? Does this suffer when it's not getting food or it has a full nappy? I think we should generally say it doesn't seem likely, but it's an eerie picture, especially when you think about this little infant floating in this infinitely black space. It's even more eerie when you read this quote, which is far too much text for anybody to read, from the German philosopher Thomas Metzinger, that starts by thundering, what would you say if somebody came along and said, hey, we want to genetically engineer mentally retarded human infants? They would be really useful for research, of course. But as Thomas argues, it would, of course, be really wrong to do it. And he argues that we could make conscious software, that it would be wrong to maltreat. We should actually make sure we avoid making software that functions like that. He didn't know about the cyberchild when I told him about it, but it fits in rather eerily well. So some philosophers are convinced that you could actually have conscious software. Other philosophers will happily tell you, no, it's not possible. And then you have complications like Daniel Dennett, who wrote a very good paper, Why You Can't Make a Computer That Feels Pain, that nevertheless ended by concluding that that's mostly because we don't understand what pain is. Once we figured out what we mean by pain, or rather the thing that we hand wave at when we're talking about pain, we could perhaps make it. He also suggests an interesting thing, that at that point we could make machines that could suffer. And he says, in the meantime, thoughtful people would refrain from kicking such a robot. But here, of course, we have this problem. We're not going to settle this. Philosophers are not famous for agreeing on anything. So what do? We might actually, thanks to brain emulation, which after all is intended to copy everything in a brain, including the ability to feel suffering or pain, end up with virtual animals that potentially might suffer just as much as real animals, if you believe that software could do it. Others are going to say, no, that's just numbers being moved around. It's just as no experience as in the Tamagotchi. And then the philosophers will tear into each other. It's very interesting to see it, because they're very convinced, they have very good arguments, and they're not able to really budge each other. So my suggestion is, of course, being very Swedish and a conflict averse, is let's be better safe than sorry. We should just assume that if software behaves like it was conscious, and is based on something we have a good reason to think is conscious and could suffer in the real world, then we should probably treat it accordingly. Now, the cyberchild is actually not based exactly on a real human brain. It's not a scan of any infant. It's just a loose model. So I think we can be pretty safe that there is nothing going on there. But if you scan a mouse brain and run all the computations and run it in a little virtual body, then I think you should actually consider how you treat it. It would be just as wrong to pinch the virtual mouse tail as it would be to pinch the real mouse tail. This, of course, leads to a lot of very fun things for me to annoy my colleagues in neuroscience. We actually better think about the animal ethics of virtual animals. So one of the first things we might want to do is just copy the stuff we get from the home office about how to treat real lab animals into the virtual world and see what maps over. For example, pain and suffering. You can actually get rid of a lot of that by just not running those parts of the brain, leaving out pain signals, or even running perfect virtual painkillers that make sure there is no activity in the pain and suffering circuit. There are other interesting problems which might be a bit more profound, like quality of life. Just living in a small cage is not very fun, probably not for rats, and definitely not for humans and higher organisms. We have started to become aware that it actually matters to have an adequate environment. In the case of brain emulation, we might even need to make adequate bodies, which might mean we need to research how rat fur really should feel to a rat. So we might have to work rather hard to make sure that we're not just putting our virtual lab animals into some form of second life, which is too boring. We might also think about what it means at the end of experiment when we delete a piece of software. This was actually what led me into this whole line of investigation many years back. I ended my work for the day and I turned off my computer and I realized I just deleted a little neural network with 100 nerve cells. Did I just kill something? I wasn't sure, and then I realized that probably the chemical reaction networks in the bacteria on the floor, which were stepping on, were probably more complex. So assuming complexity and consciousness were the same thing, which of course wouldn't give me a passing grade on any philosophy exam, I gleefully went home. But I think we can do interesting things here, because if you delete something in a computer, you can restore it from backup. Indeed, it might be possible to kill animals and have them back next morning, which leads to interesting question about what life projects would a virtual animal be allowed to have? Should we have one copy of a virtual mouse living an indefinite mouse life in a complicated world, and then we take occasional copies that we use for experiments? Would that make our conscience good? Some of you might have, of course, realized that if it works on mice and monkeys, it probably works on humans. And this is, of course, the main reason I'm really interested in this and why we're thinking about it at the Future Humanity Institute. What would the implications be if we tried this on a human brain and it actually worked? I don't have the time to get into this, because obviously this rabbit hole is really deep. Some problems actually become easier, like the moral status. You could actually ask the brain-emulated person, "Sir, do you feel conscious?" And if you have scanned a philosopher who believes that the machines cannot be conscious, and now the scanned version of the philosopher looks up and says, "Darn, I feel conscious." Good. We have evidence for some moral status. It would be even more bizarre, of course, if he said, "No, I do not feel conscious." I have no clue what we should do there. Getting volunteers might be mildly tricky. Early research is going to have some flaws. We're going to have a lot of interest in medical ethics questions about how do we handle software that is not working really well if you find yourself virtual but have a perennial hangover that cannot go away. And what about speed? Current big supercomputing simulations in computational neuroscience typically run slower than real time, mostly because we time them by having a coffee break. But if you live virtually, you might actually want to keep up with the real world. Your human rights as part of a society might actually involve being able to interact with the real world. So you might have a right to be run as fast as needed. Or maybe even faster, which can also lead to problems. We have obvious questions about personal identity. Would a brain emulation of me actually be me? And I personally believe that that depends on your theory of identity. I happen to have a really crazy one, which allows me to claim that, yes, all my brain emulations are me. But a lot of you are not going to fall for that. Being software is also something that makes you very vulnerable. You can be deleted or edited. So we need to think about how we control this. And it's going to change the world if this ever happens. It's going to change so much that I think it's actually worth thinking about these things decades ahead of time. I think we're going to share this world with software life within this century, and I want to make it a nice one. Thank you.